Thank you for joining us on the breaking news update. Ladies and gentlemen, we are getting in a news input into our newsrooms right now. The Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, has confirmed that he's received a call from the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Prime Minister Modi tweeting, "Thank my friend President Putin for his phone call and for sharing insights on his recent meeting with President Donald Trump in Alaska. India has consistently called for a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine conflict and supports all efforts in this regard. I look forward to our continued exchanges in the days to come." Prime Minister Modi has spoken to Vladimir Putin, and Putin has discussed and detailed out his meeting with US President Donald Trump. Prime Minister has said that Putin has shared insights on that recent meeting with Donald Trump, which took place late night Friday, early morning Saturday in Alaska. So that's a breaking news input that's coming in. And this is after, in fact, that meeting lasted about 2 hours, 45 minutes. And on his part, the US President Donald Trump spoke to Zelensky, spoke to European leaders, debriefing them on his conversation with Vladimir Putin. Not just that, the US President is then further meeting Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, tonight in what will be a decisive meeting to detail out what comes next in the war in Ukraine. And this is exactly 2 days after that critical meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, India's friend, has dialed Prime Minister Modi and given him a full lowdown. One of the big takeaways of Vladimir Putin's meeting with the US President Donald Trump has been his statement where he said on record, took to the stage in the joint conference and said that the bilateral trade between US and Russia had increased by over 20%, an indication of things to come. In fact, he punctured the US stand completely on doing business with Russia when he himself said in Trump's presence that the trade between those two countries had risen, and Putin has spoken to Prime Minister Modi as well. Very, very interesting. My colleague Krutat is now joining us. Krutat, India's position has been very clear from the beginning that we want that war to end. But more importantly, what Putin said on that stage, that Russian trade had increased with America about 20%, that one line punctured the entire stand of America.
Indeed, Niranjan, and today we are also accessing some exclusive details of what happened on the call between President Putin and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Notably, this is the second call in span of 2 weeks, one before the meeting and now one after the meeting in Alaska. And we have information that President Putin had specifically called Prime Minister Narendra Modi to brief him about the Alaska summit and the discussions that happened between US and Russia and his impressions of the negotiations that are ongoing at the same time. Prime Minister Narendra Modi once again reiterated that this is not an era of war and how India has always been for a peaceful negotiation and resolution of the conflict in Ukraine peacefully. Both of the nations also interestingly talked about their bilateral relationships and how they both share together a special privileged partnership. So notably, reading between the lines, it can be inferred to that trade between India and Russia and the crisis of tariffs and the energy imports of India from Russia was also something that perhaps could have found some form of mention between the conversation of President Putin and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But it is also very important that today President Putin perhaps is on a spree of dialing to all the BRICS member nations and all the allies of Russia. We saw earlier today he also had a conversation with the South African counterpart, and now a phone call to Prime Minister Narendra Modi to brief about the details of what happened in Alaska and what were the impressions of President Putin. Now, President Putin and Prime Minister Narendra Modi share a very good and cordial bond, and both of the leaders have been in constant communication. In fact, Prime Minister Narendra Modi also had a conversation with Vladimir Zelensky a couple of days ago. So these are back-to-back conversations happening, and India also emerging as an active interlocutor between Russia and Ukraine vis-a-vis dialogue, and perhaps even providing its support in terms of an ally which is towards a resolution of the conflict in a peaceful manner. But a very important call coming in from President Putin, and how he also took a swipe at the United States, as you rightly pointed out, about US's increasing trade with Russia. Surely the trade between India and Russia is something that might have found a mention in this phone call, and it will be all eyes now on what India does subsequently, because the Trump's tariff deadline only goes into force from the month of September, and the trade delegation that was supposed to visit India next week is clearly not coming, and secondary sanctions at the moment are on a pause. So 50% tariff threat on India continues to loom, but India is not backing down. Russia is standing with it, and both the leaders had a very, very good conversation once again today after the Alaska summit, second in the span of just last 2 weeks.
Okay, in fact, I have a very, very detailed read that's come in, a detailed release from the Prime Minister's office, which says that Putin shared his assessment of the meeting with President Trump in Alaska, and the Prime Minister underlined India's consistent position for a peaceful resolution of the conflict, reiterating India's support for all efforts in this regard. And the two leaders also discussing a number of issues of bilateral cooperation between India and Russia, and the two leaders agreed to remain in close touch. The two leaders also touched upon a number of issues of bilateral cooperation to strengthen special, privileged, strategic partnership. Now that's the term used. Special, privileged, strategic partnership between India and Russia, and that the two leaders have agreed to remain in close touch. Let's move on to the